Where I grew up in Sweden in the late 90s and early 2000s, the technological revolution that would connect the world and enable media consumption anywhere and everywhere was just getting started, bringing with it a serious increase in consumable media in forms of games, shows, kids' entertainment, and so on. The thing about movies, TV, and most notably cartoons was at the time they were relatively new media, and they had to sort of fight for their legitimacy. By the time Tiny Me came along, only a few movies had broken the mold and gone beyond casual viewing and entertainment and managed to go for the gold, the high art, the drama, the romance, the bloodshed. For the rest of the media I was exposed to at the time, cartoons, video games, and some licensed toys, the aim was much lower, a very commercial rather than culturally refined goal, and as such I was made to feel quite shameful for enjoying them. This shame was then expanded upon when I realized that there really wasn't a place out there in the world to celebrate and enjoy this low form of art, thus leading me and people like me to the necessity of creating an underground culture. This attitude towards games had been previously reinforced by its own creators, treating it as not much more than a complement to a franchise and, as such, not putting much work into it being an enjoyable experience, or for that matter, exploring the medium. This rather cynical approach changed over the course of a few years, and in the 90s a bunch of reputable franchises solely dedicated to games as the medium were on the rise. It was the age of Blizzard, Nintendo, Sega, and many more that would build a brand that would stand the test of time. In terms of quality, the medium was certainly swiftly improving, but it would take another few years for people to generally change their attitudes towards said medium, and in many ways, people still haven't. Memes like "Gamers Rise Up" seems to be a nod towards the plight of the noble nerd, sticking to their games, comics and cartoons in the face of adversity, and parodically compare said plights to actual political plights such as racism or homophobia. Yeah. Whatever can be said for how things turned out for the nerds of the 90s and whatever communities they managed to create, there is a fact that cannot be ignored. The game is being redeemed, not only through esporting events rivaling that of other physical sports, but through the extended exploration of the potential storytelling of an interactive media experience. The lay of the land seemed to be that there is a great potential for immersion in a story when the subject itself is permitted to interact and possibly even change the direction of the story. The potential for creating art through this medium is being realized, and the relation between the textual body of work and its receptor is being explored deeper day by day. Games like the Stanley Parable, Undertale, and Fallout would emphasize the power of the player in relation to the world of the game, whereas others like Doki Doki Literature Club would delve into diegesis. Where we ended up is an expanding cultural universe where the pioneers get to tell their stories in increasingly immersive and interactive ways, and the nerds that got bullied for their affinity for what was new, alien, and enchanting has a chance to tell their story to their peers. And what started with games of little substance has evolved into epics staring into the unexplored void of cultural expression. As the digital revolution picked up speed, it brought with it a connectivity made available for all. The rapid evolution of the internet, although at times botched by censorship and corporate greed, brought people awareness of each other all over the world. News media, social media, culture, crisis, all of it was now accessible for anyone with a means to connect. And the recent generations of children have grown up with this change, made aware of the world around them like never before. News media utilized the internet excellently to broadcast their stuff in the most sensational way as to attract views. And wherever there was misery, sensation was sure to follow. And like never before, people who had previously lived sheltered lives far away from wars and poverty was made aware And in combination with an increasing cultural focus on individuality and self-centrism, the question that was led on people's mind was, what do I make of this? Do I dismiss it? Will I try and do my part in bettering it despite my efforts being small in the grand scheme? See, as the world's sheer size in lives and causes was now in full display, this individualism too seemed futile. And people that was raised with a small world in mind got exposed to the largest expansion of worldview ever made accessible to humanity. What would we make of that? I do not think it is a coincidence that people of my generation increasingly would try escapism, devoting themselves into fictional worlds, joining fandoms, and worlds of sense-making and control where our own reality could offer no such thing. Where religious movements tended to answer questions that increasingly got answered by the progress of science, science could not provide any answer as to more philosophical matters. Most religious texts have rather outdated views on society as a whole, and as such its philosophical merits got sort of dismissed. And so a generation had to answer the increasingly bothersome question, what's the point? What do I do with all this information? Why would anything I do matter if I'm just a tiny speck on a planet that is tiny in itself with a lifespan that is utterly futile in comparison to the age of the world? Unless filled by religious conviction, these questions would eat away at anyone curious enough to ask them. It is my full belief that this question is the central theme of Discord Murder Party. So what exactly is Discord Murder Party and why should you care? At face value, it seems like your average game stream or radio show or podcast, but it turns out things are actually a bit more sexy than that. Discord Murder Party started out as just a stream with the YouTube channel Internet Remix, which is the meme and fun stuff channel offspring to Man of the Internet Productions, famous for Freaky Fettuccine, mumbled movie minutes, and a freaking awesome 4-hour musical show based off of Undertale. Anyway, the stream of Internet Remix was supposed to just be a fun game night with friends, essentially, where they would play a game of Mafia/Werewolf/Witches of Salem, playing some goofy characters to spice things up, and that would be that. The stream got quite popular, and the character of the Game Master, played by Kristen Trawczynski, and that of Dr. McGillicuddy, a goofy reoccurring character in the games, played by Alex Beckham, got more fleshed out. On the 6th episode, however, things started to take off for real, as the game between the Game Master, now called Murder God, and the Awakened took off, as the character Vincent Marshall Reed awakes from his slumber and realizes that he is trapped in a repeating game of blood and death. So what happened here is that what was first thought to be just a game in good fun with no serious diegetic elements attached to it was now revealed to in fact be very diegetic. Since this at first wasn't the intention of the stream, there was some iffiness about the canonicity of the first 5 episodes, and they are not listed in the Discord Murder Party playlist of the channel. But to me, the first 5 episodes are vital to understand how the story came to life. They also happen to be freaking hilarious, so go watch them. Even if you don't care for the larger story, these episodes are still great. There is also something to be said for how the story interacts with the fourth wall, as viewers have been continuously able to impact the game with donations to the channel reflected as the spinning of a wheel that directly changes things about the games. Murder God also continuously refers to the audience as a vital part of what keeps the games running. This would have been spicy enough on its own, but there's also a deeper game for the audience to take part in, where in a sort of Scott Cawthon-esque manner, some videos leave codes, ciphers, and riddles at their end for the audience to solve, as to get clues on what's going on with the bigger picture of the story. In summation, we have a flat game of Mafia/Werewolf/Witches of Salem as a base. In addition to this, we have the characters that take place in the games, a deeper version of said characters called the Awakened, having cast off their masks and remaining the same character throughout all episodes from the moment they awaken, and their struggle against the murder god. Outside of this is us, the audience, with our power to impact the games and the riddles left for us to solve in some of the videos. It's all so simple! The story starts and stops on many levels, with its multifaceted narration structure, its monologues on each character's background story, and in some cases needing to revisit or revise some characters, critiquing the very nature of the story itself. Diegetically, the story structure itself is many times berated by its characters, both by the players and by the murder god. Rather like someone of our own world berating nature for being cruel about the very concept of suffering. It is equally futile, equally justified, and ultimately serves the big parallel of DMP as a work of art commenting on the sad state of reality itself. Because the struggles of the characters in DMP is made to mirror the struggles of our own world. In a sense, it becomes a concise summary of the vices and struggles of our modern day life. For some characters more than others. Let's take a look. Dr. McGillicuddy is the first reoccurring character in Discord Murder Party, and the first sign of there being a continuous narrative in the show, and through him we get the first real signs of the metaplot's existence in the first half of the first season. As Dr. McGillicuddy, yes, Doctor is his first name, gets characterized, so does the entire plot of the show. As Discord Murder Party at first wasn't made to be anything more than, well, a fun game night with friends where nothing bad happens, Dr. McGillicuddy started off as a kind of joke, a recurring character with a funny avuncular voice spouting some nonsense and then disappearing in a poof of smoke. But a few episodes in, the tone shifts and the cracks begin to show, as the Doctor, along with the show, takes a way darker turn. The existence of a reoccurring character in a game where the point is to kill everyone else again and again and again gets some exploration. It's essentially a wake-up call, telling the audience, hey, this thing you're enjoying watching, it's actually horrifying to the people that have to endure it. Much of the Doctor's character is still largely a mystery, but it was revealed in a DMP special that he worked on the Manhattan Project, so the narrative point of the character seems to steer towards exploring the guilt and responsibilities of evil in the name of greater good, something that gets even more nuance with the introduction of Junior No Last Name. The story of Vincent Marshall Reed is about the futility of war. Not only the futility in going into conflict and causing destruction upon one another, but also the futility of a noble war, because the big revelation to Vincent Reed is that the war he fought was not the last war. It wasn't the war to end all wars, and it wasn't the Great War. It was merely a prelude of the slaughter that would follow only some 20 years later. The message that awaits Vincent is like running headfirst into a concrete wall. His sacrifice, the sacrifice of every soldier, every victim of war, was in vain. The sacrifices of everyone was ultimately pointless. There would be more wars, worse wars, and more people would suffer more, as World War II came along and reduced every story, every hope and dream and sacrifice and bloodshed of every victim of World War I to naught but a number to be bookkept. Vincent gave everything, he went all in, and he lost. Discord Murder Party for Vincent is just Vincent keeps losing. For his life and his soul, all he gets is the revelation from the very first episode he appears in. You can't save them all. You can't save anyone. In real life, this mentality can be translated onto not only soldiers, but to anyone who is fighting for something. Ultimately, one has to come to terms with the fact that anything one fights to preserve or save or change is temporary. No one can truly be saved. Humans are mortal, societies are fluid, and empires fall. There is no stopping conflict, and yet, to save anything, one must participate. It's a Sisyphus symbol, rolling that rock upwards for eternity. The story of Grace Garden is about the struggles of a mental illness, of how pressure, abuse, stress, and even compassion can ultimately lead one down a path of destruction. It's about the heartless world that surrounds Grey's Garden, the reluctant detective condemning criminals in a war-torn Britain in a time that saw the most brutal crimes against humanity in modern time. And yet, the backdrop of war and genocide takes a step back in the story of Grace. It's a narrative that is more focused inwards, not as much as what the humans are doing with the world, but what the world is doing to the individual person. The duties and expectations, and let's not forget the actual abuse, put on her by her uncle puts Grace under such stress that she snaps under the pressure and suppresses her emotions completely, effectively becoming a machine, cold and calculating. And to me, there is something horrifying about the realization of how much sense it makes. There is an idealization of sorts, of this state of mind where results and effectiveness is deemed more important than a shred of humanity. It's like a cult of professionalism. And as such, there is to no surprise to me that the title Grace dons is defined by her profession. The detective is devoid of feeling, of emotion. There is no joy in this profession, and yet, in the real world, this level of profession over heart is actively encouraged by our culture. One is allowed to have a heart, of course, but never as to obstruct one's ability to work, to be productive. In such a culture, mental illness runs rampant, for it is a natural breeding ground. Because guess what? Humans are in fact not supposed to be cold and calculating robots. And it is ultimately a completely ridiculous goal to rid oneself of care and feelings. Even the most vocal proponents of this ideology have strong feelings in them, albeit mainly directed against people showing feelings, which is a rabbit hole of irony that won't serve the purpose of my point to jump into. But since it is such an alien yet dominant concept, the nature of feeling humanity clashes with the cold-hearted calculator that is expected of oneself. This clash is the driving point of Grace Garden's perspective into Discord Murder Party, and one that is rather brilliantly put for show with its climactic moments culminating in the Lotus Eater episode after Grace Garden's character starts her journey anew. But that is a talking point for another time. I'm having a hard time talking about Tommy Gwendolyn in a purely analytical manner because of him being confined to very limited joys in life and not knowing whether he will live another 2 years or another 2 weeks. It's a bit too close to home, to me and for many others. See, I have the perspective of one that sits beside the hospital bed, and I cannot even fathom what a cancer in my own body would feel like, what it would do with my outlook on life, on existence. The story of Tommy Gwendolyn is about the hopelessness and frustration without resolution that comes with fighting a disease. Whilst Murder God is an excellent antagonist of a symbol for everything that is evil in this world, there isn't really a way to properly portray the antagonism inherent in a disease. It is generally invisible, it cannot be reasoned with, protested against, or stopped by means to stop any other kind of antagonist. It is not even the kind of dehumanized human, such like the orcs of Middle-earth or the Cybermen of Doctor Who. Disease doesn't communicate at all. It just is. It eats and destroys for no other reason than its very nature, dictated by something as banal as laws of physics and evolution. Tommy Gwendolyn is fighting a losing war against an enemy that is like no other. There is no victory, only consolation. There is no cure, only sedation. I'm not too surprised that this theme hasn't been explored all that much since we got the backstory for Tommy. And it's dreadful, sure, but it's also banal and simple. There's no use shouting at it. One might as well shout at God. The answer will still be silence. So Tommy sleeps. What else is there to do? The stories of Junior, no last name, and Christine Forks are once again an interesting twist of narrative structure. Fundamentally, they both build on the exact same events occurring, yet from two different perspectives. Even more interesting, the tragedy of Christine Forks starts on the night of the final Grace Killer murders, whereas for Junior, this was just the final piece of a puzzle of one dreadful event after another. Junior, aka the Grace Killer, had previously killed over a dozen of people in the name of the cult that recruited him as a young boy, the Black Stars. For Junior, this story is about the vulnerability of young, lonely people and how easy it is to use them for anyone who is willing to show them even the slightest bit of attention. It's an extreme case, of course, where Junior becomes an executioner for a group of religious zealots, mainly because said zealots were the only people he had met that would give him what all young lost people search for: a place to call home, an identity, something to be proud of, and, in a twisted sort of way, love. Because of this, Junior would be convinced that the killings was for the greater good, and that by murdering innocent people he was essentially making the world a better place. It wasn't until the narrative of killing bad people cracked that Junior would turn away from the cult. The last murder, that of Christine Fork's family, was misdirected and was meant for someone else. When Junior confronted his adoptive father, who was the one to recruit him for the cult, he simply deflected the question, saying it's all for the glory of the Black Stars. It didn't matter who died, it was essentially a blood for the blood god kind of deal. This didn't work with the vigilante narrative that gave Junior his sense of identity and gave legitimacy to his killings. Imagine you are reading an issue of The Punisher. It's a violent comic, but it's about a hard-ass man killing bad people who deserve it. Imagine you see yourself in The Punisher, you relate to him, and suddenly it is revealed that all the people he had killed was actually innocent, victims of circumstance, or the Punisher was simply delusional. What I'm trying to say is, it is at this point, not before, that Junior realizes what he has actually done. That he is no different from a monstrous serial killer. There was no glory, no justice, and no point to what he had done. All of his identity was built on a lie, and that lie had cost almost 20 people their lives. For Christine Forks, the narrative essentially starts the day just before the night of the murder of her family. It is foreshadowed in the most heart-wrenching ways, and the performance of the church scene does in a concise way portray her family as a happy, functional, and stable family, full of love and hope for the future. Such a simple thing as the kids hoping for ice cream tomorrow conveys the hope for the future that we as the audience by the time the scene plays know is impossible. There won't be ice cream tomorrow. There won't even be tomorrow. One could argue that the focal point of these two intersecting characters is Junior. He is the ex-acolyte of the Black Stars, he is the one with redemption to make, with a reason for what he is doing. The story is about the killing, and of a repentant killer. Christine's story serves mainly the narrative point of humanizing Junior's victims. It drives home the point that not only did the Forks family deserve to live, but all of the other victims did too. It serves to hold the perpetrator accountable for his actions, and to show that a horrible action, no matter how ill-conceived or regretted, still has consequences. Yes, Junior was manipulated. Yes, he was a victim of circumstance. But a loving husband and 2 children are no less dead because of his actions. And that responsibility is something he is gonna have to shoulder for the rest of his life. Percy Blackwood comes with a tonal change in his backstory and his reasons for making the deal with Murder God. He has no malignant past he wishes to rectify or some damage to be healed or averted, but rather his reasons for making the deal is hope. He wishes to follow his dreams of becoming an artist, but as he is held back by his duties imposed upon him, he makes his wish so as to be able to pursue that dream. It's a wish for self-actualization, as opposed to earlier characters whose wish mainly was made as an act of sacrifice, except for Tommy, but he got screwed by his demon lawyer in a way that sort of meant as a continuation of his suffering, so Tommy basically didn't get a wish at all. Anyway, This hopeful and rather positive tone of Percy's wish comes off as rather self-indulgent and utterly naive to his awakened peers, to the annoyance of all but mostly Dr. McGillicuddy and Grace Garden. It is actually a breath of fresh air into the show with a cheerful and hopeful and utterly trusting point of view. Percy is the first character to come off friendly towards the murder god, citing her as his muse and trying to make sense of the other characters' negative view of her in a more positive and harmless light. Suffice to say, this doesn't vibe very well with the established narrative, and poor Percy, for his hopes and dreams, gets punished, not only by Murder God but also by his fellow Awakened, being constantly berated for trying to view things in a more positive light. The narrative of Percy as a naive dreamer before entering the games isn't as much of a focal point as is his dissentment among the Awakened. It actually kind of foreshadows the reveal in Season 3 of things not being as simply in black and white as we were first led to believe. His belief in people's good intentions have misguided him for sure, but they turn out not to be without merit. The innocence and purity of a dreamer who believes in everyone's inherent goodness can actually be a powerful instrument of change in people who everyone else believes to be beyond redemption. The "shut up Percy" memes may be funny, but Percy's point of view has a power to change people in a way that a cynical person could never do. And Percy is arguably the first character in the entire show that is not a complete cynic. The awakening of Valencia Lynch brings with it an interesting revelation. There are other worlds out there. Valencia is the princess of a place called Pravam, which is located neither in Hungary nor anywhere else. It's a kingdom from a different world altogether, an alternate dimension timed somewhere around the 1600s but with dragons and magic. What ties that world and ours together is the existence of the Cult of the Black Stars. The Black Stars have a cult activity in Valencia's homeworld as well, and its doings directly impact why Valencia is here. The narrative purpose of exploring Valencia's perspective comes not so much in building her character, but rather in world building. Through the eyes of the Princess of Pravam, we get to know a great deal more of the mysterious deities referred to as the Black Stars, of their motives and how they work. It's an interesting contrast to the perspective of Junior, where the Black Star cult seemed more like the religious extremists present in our world. As in the world of Valencia, the fantastical elements of the cult is way more pronounced. Actual magic and summonings of gods occur here, and some of the nature of Murder God is revealed, as she seems not to be the only Black Star out there. Except for world building, Valencia's character is also a much needed source of comedy. In a fish out of water type of deal, she has hilarious run-ins with the other Awakened, all of them so far stemming from our reality, when she struggles to comprehend the ins and outs of a world without magic that has aged about 400 years more than hers. In a way, it also serves to bring the entire narrative of the show together, as the Awakened basically have to summarize what the deal of the show is. This becomes rather necessary as the large cast of people with in-depth stories would otherwise risk becoming cluttered and hard to follow. Also, she has a romance with Percy and it's fucking adorable. There are more Awakened characters to be discussed as of right now, but they are all relatively recent additions to the story, and as such they don't have an overwhelmingly much about them to analyze. As such, I'm gonna let the story continue for a while before making a statement about them. I would also like to keep some of the story unspoiled for anyone I happen to inspire to watch the show with this video. And in interest of keeping the plot unspoiled, or relatively unspoiled, I'm gonna refrain from analyzing these Awakened for now. I'm sure this might come as a bit of a disappointment, but I want to be able to get the full picture about them before saying something about them, and as of right now, that's just not possible. I will say that Season 3 so far has been absolutely great, and you should totally watch it. But you didn't think I would forget the god of murder herself, did you? The head honcho herself, the narrator, the writer, the director, the murder god, the sky of black stars, the void given breath, the empty chasm in your chest, the aching dwarf of the abyss. I got lucky with this one, as Kristen Trawczynski herself volunteered to answer some of my questions, the results of which I now intend to present. I was surprised to learn that the concept of the Black Star's pantheon was created way before Discord Murder Party was a thing, inspired by philosophical concepts coming from the show True Detective. There was also some inspiration taken from the pantheon of H.P. Lovecraft, fueled by the real-life mystery of the so-called bloop, a deep-water sound recording that baffles science to this day, the implication being that it's a sleeping deity of really whatever. When it comes to the characterization for Murder God, calling her Murder God is actually kind of missing the point of her character, ironical as it may seem. The act of murder is merely the most personal, dramatic, and impactful narrative act, and she kind of is a writer first and a god second. I quote Kristen, "To bring death to someone else is basically a pinnacle action of emotion and expression, even if it's not personal. To the victim, it absolutely would be. Really, when it boils down to it, she is more of a god of storytelling than murder specifically, but she exists in a universe that insists all stories must end poorly." This way of looking at life can be directly translated to our world, as all ends can be interpreted as tragedies, and since we live in a universe bound to laws of matter and physics, all life eventually ends. As such, it could be viewed as life as a concept is stuck in an endless circle of tragedy. We must eat to not die, we must destroy to live, yet we die sooner or later anyway. The anxiety that hits with that realization that everything must end seems impossible to mitigate with scientific explanations. Existential dread breeds spirituality, as to bring forth a point with it all. Imagine you have access to all scientific truths about our life on Earth. Now what? Living in a world where religious movements are losing more and more influence on the world, their legitimacy suffering as a result, anyone thinking about this gets stuck in a limbo. Science holds no answers, and just making stuff up to comfort yourself, as is a popular view of religious beliefs, doesn't work once the cracks start to show. So where do we go from there? In the grand scheme of things, nothing matters. Joy doesn't matter. Sadness doesn't matter. Nothing matters. But we cannot accept it. We need a point to our life. The stress that this vacancy puts on us is embodied in the character of the murder god. Her pettiness, her cruelty, and her utter lack of compassion to the people she tortures in the game seems to mirror that voice inside your head. That voice that tells you can never win, never get out, never succeed. The voice telling you that no matter what you do, no matter how high you climb, you will never feel whole. The voice that incessantly reminds you that however much work you put into your hopes and dreams, above you there is a truth that will never budge to your will. It is the cold, uncaring truth. Everything must end. To fight that, to fight nature, is to fight truth itself. Or is it? If one looks at the grand scheme of things, at the history of the universe with open eyes, a different truth can be derived. In the beginning there was nothing. No light, no matter, nothing. Today our world is teeming with life, flora, fauna, and though everything must end, where our story ends, others will pick up the torch and carry on. We will lose some of us, but we will never lose all of us, and when the day comes that we lie a mouldering in the grave, our spirit will march on in the hearts of everyone we touched throughout our lives, everyone we made an impression upon, friends, family, enemies. Our footsteps remain in the ground, and our impression, no matter how big or small, will forever change the world. I'll end with a quote Kristen told me from True Detective. "You know you're looking at it wrong, that sky thing. Once there was only dark. If you ask me, the light is winning."